They don't require a stockpile of bullets or shells. They just need energy, and then they can fight. So yes, there is a cost to develop them, but once they're in service, their use cost is much, much cheaper. If you think of a missile system, you've got to buy those missiles. They can be very expensive.
The Ministry of Defence say British soldiers have developed new technology that can defeat attack drones by using radio waves. It's a trial that's been taking place in Wales. Attack drones have been responsible for an estimated 80% of all casualties in Ukraine. So this new technology could prove to be priceless. Drone weapons are relatively easy to improvise in the field, but Iran have been producing powerful kamikaze drones for Russian use. Well, James Cartlidge is the Conservative defence spokesman and believes the UK could be a powerhouse for drone defence technology. He joins us now. James, good morning.
Good morning.
Just explain to us the front line of what's happening, particularly in Ukraine. 80% of attack drones are responsible for all of the casualties, for 80% of the casualties. Sorry. Tell us how these drones work.
Well, I think it's an incredibly important statistic because if you look at the First and Second World War, I believe the sort of similar, maybe not the same percentage, but very much the biggest killer on the actual battlefields. Obviously, this is not including bombing of civilian areas and so on, but the biggest killer on the battlefield was artillery. And so that's a massive change in how fighting is taking place. And what we hear from the front line is that drones are everywhere. They're ubiquitous. In fact, they're having a huge psychological effect on soldiers who are participating. But above all, as you say, and I think you actually made what is the most important point in all of this, they are evolving so quickly. There will have been significant developments in artillery fighting during the Second World War. I mean, the Germans famously used an anti-air gun very, very effectively, and I'm afraid lethally, against us in the Second World War. So that was an improvisation. But with drones, it's happening literally all the time. They are changing, the heights at which they might fly, other features and characteristics to enable them to compete against their adversary. There's recently been this important change in terms of using fiber optics. So it's just the way it's changing all the time. The scale and mass of the drones involved that are being produced in vast numbers on both sides, and meaning that they are now a key feature of warfare in Ukraine, and as we also saw in the Red Sea.
There therefore is then this sort of technology battle going on to try and outsmart the latest edition of the weapons that the opposition, that the enemy is using. You've seen these drones, this company that's been receiving real-time feedback from the front line so that they can then tweak the technology they're using. What's happening?
So I always talk about this experience because when I became Defence Procurement Minister under the last government, you'll remember how defence procurement was sort of, dare I say it, almost infamous for having these very long, drawn-out procurements that were beset with problems. Now, just to be clear, that was very far from the common picture, but obviously when you had major programmes, and as to Ajax, the armed vehicle was one of those, though I'm pleased to say it's now in a far better position. The concept of procurement as being something rapid was very far from people's perception. But when I went to visit this company, this is in October 2023, they were a UK SME who were developing a drone to be used in Ukraine. It would be used highly effectively. What struck me about the visit was they were getting real-time information from the front, and they were adapting to it very, very quickly at a pace I'd never seen in the way that we procure in the UK. And, I took away from that we need to develop at a far greater pace. We need to be far more focused on technology, and also to recognise that that's where we do have strengths, because we have a very good science base in defence, DSTL famously at Porton Down. And I think we are in a position to harness these technologies to boost both what we call the lethality and survivability of our forces, i.e. to protect those forces we will fight with, but also to give us that extra cutting edge should contest ever come again.
You're also having to invest in the other side, so technology that defeats the enemy's drones.
Absolutely.
There has been this quite amazing, groundbreaking use of radio waves in Wales that the British Army have trialled. The UK government have been investing £40 million in research into radio frequency directed energy weapons. That's what they're called. But effectively, they are capable of neutralising multiple targets simultaneously with a near instant effect. And apparently it costs about 10 pence per shot fired. I mean, this could be a really significant development.
Absolutely. And for me, when I saw these directed energy weapons, there were two that I was particularly looking at the time, one of which you just talked about, radio frequency weapon. The other was the laser, we call Dragonfire. And the thing that's so important about them, there's several features. The first is they don't require a stockpile of bullets or shells. They just need energy, and then they can fight. So yes, there is a cost to develop them, but once they're in service, their use cost is much, much cheaper. You know, if you think of a missile system, you've got to buy those missiles. They can be very expensive. And in fact, a key reason why I was focused on energy weapons was that in the Red Sea, you'll recall that our ships have been deployed, Royal Naval ships in the Red Sea, attacked by Houthi drones, and potentially having to use very expensive missiles to defeat them. Whereas what we needed was something that could combat them at low cost, so that the missiles were kept to deal with the ballistic missile threat or other such more complex threats, you might call them.
And it looks like that's what this radio frequency might be able to do. It says it can defeat airborne targets at ranges up to 1 kilometre, and they're quite effective against threats which can't be jammed using electronic warfare. So this is sort of a new field.
Important to stress, this is, a lot of people see that weapon and they think it's a jammer. It's not a jammer. It is what's called a kinetic radio strike. You're sending a radio wave which literally burns out the middle of all the drones within its range. So it's relatively indiscriminate, and the range, it needs to be increased. But you could already imagine how if you've got a deployed ground force, this, you know, on your sort of perimeter defending you against incoming drones could be highly effective. I just feel, you know, in this class of weapons, directed energy weapons, because of the progress we've made, because of our science base, we have got to absolutely chase, you know, having advantage in these weapons, because as you say, we've got to be able to defend our people. If you think that if we could find weapons that could actually, you know, defend against drone threats, and you could put them on our platform, so, you know, on our tanks or on our ships, that would transform our defensive position. But of course, as we've already said, things change so quickly. So once they're in service, you've then got to have this culture of being prepared to adapt them constantly. But basically, very encouraging to hear about this trial that's been reported today. It does sound like we're continuing to make progress, and I think these weapons will be very important, and I hope that we continue to pursue them.
Just briefly, James, I wish we had more time, but this is all happening in the conversation of the backdrop of today, a meeting in Paris that Emmanuel Macron will be having with the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, also Washington Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, with the idea of talking about efforts to end the war in Ukraine. It feels actually as though that's further away than we'd anticipated.
Well, and obviously overnight, more attacks, more loss of civilian life, tragically, in Ukraine. And so, you know, reminding us of the reality that the war for the people of Ukraine goes on, the losses continue to mount. That's the same on the military front line as well, with terrible losses on the Russian side, it must be said. So we all want peace, but it has to be a lasting peace that will give security to the people of Ukraine. So we do hope that these meetings and the diplomacy that's happening is successful. But in the meantime, we must be clear-eyed and realistic that the Russians are still attacking Ukraine, and do everything possible, therefore, to support that nation.
James, thank you very much. James Cartlidge, the Conservative MP and Shadow Defence Secretary, thank you.